This is a lecture to cover spinal cord anatomy. So we're going to continue with the central nervous system and talk about the spinal cord, how it's structured, and how the spinal nerves, parts of the peripheral nervous system, emanate off of that. The spinal cord starts at the base of the brain, at the brainstem, all right, and then extends out from the medulla, and as it extends out through the foramen magnum of the skull, it now becomes the central nervous system, becomes the spinal cord. There are four parts to the spinal cord. You have a cervical part, a thoracic region, a lumbar region, and a sacral region. They coordinate with the different parts, the same parts of the vertebral column. Okay, and you'll notice here that they underline, they kind of show two important parts of this, right? They have there's two parts of the spinal cord that are enlarged, okay? All right, they're a little bit bigger than the other regions. So the cervical enlargement and the lumbar region of the lumbar sacral region of the spinal cord are a little bit thicker or in diameter, okay, than the other regions, or the thoracic region. And that's mainly because a number of nerves emanate out from here. You can see all these nerves that emanate off. And where do they go? All right, they obviously go to the arms and over here to the legs, right? So it's understandable that there's a cervical enlargement, all that input and output of neurons to the upper extremities, and the lumbosacral enlargement, all that input and output, afferent and efferent neurons from the lower appendages. So here's your four regions of the spinal cord, and the different regions of the spinal cord and the enlargements. And you'll notice they have a couple different plexuses that are mentioned here. The brachial plexus, with the plexus we'll talk about in a little bit, the lumbar plexus, the sacral plexus. Okay, those are important for your. We'll talk about them in a little bit, where nerves actually emanate off and then they come together. Okay, so here's some more spinal cord gross anatomy, and what I want you to notice there's some important parts to this. All right, you'll notice that in the spinal cord, okay, in the brain we had gray matter on the outside and white matter was deep. The opposite is true for the spinal cord. So in the spinal cord you have this area right here. That's gray matter. Right, and on the outside of that is white matter. So out here is the white matter, and those are, myelinated axons. Okay, so myelinated, and there's important parts so they have an anterior indent and a posterior indent. So on the anterior, call that median fissure. On the posterior, call it median sulcus. Median means in the middle, and then we can talk about different areas of the gray matter, and that's what you see here in this middle picture, right? We're going to talk about the different areas of the gray matter. So you have a posterior horn. It's this extension that's out here, this posterior horn of the gray matter, while the lateral horn is this area right there, and the anterior horn is that area right there. Okay, so they have different areas of the gray matter. So the horns talk about the gray matter, and you'll see gray matter, the white matter is outside. And we'll call these, the white matter can also be can be looked at in terms of different terminology that we'll talk about in a little bit. But here, this actually, if you look at all of these together, you can see that the cervical area and the lumbar area are wider in diameter are wider in diameter than the thoracic layer, right? So just to give you an idea that the different parts of the spinal cord have a little bit different anatomies. Okay, so just like the brain, the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system, and it has 3 protective layers, connective tissue layers that help protect the spinal cord. You have just a similar, same thing as the brain, the dura mater, the arachnoid matter, and the pia mater, okay? And the pia is right over the spinal cord, and the dura mater is a little bit outside, and then you have this area right here called the epidural space. That is this right there, okay? That epidural space is important. You may have heard about an epidural in terms of giving childbirth, and that's where they put the anesthetic in there, and it helps block the spinal nerves so that a female doesn't feel anything below her waist during childbirth. So superficial to deep, you have pia is superficial, arachnoid, and dura mater. Remember that the subarachnoid space, okay, the subarachnoid space is where cerebral spinal fluid will be. All right, that's where CSF is found, okay? So that washes over the spinal cord. And you can see here, this is a spinal nerve. So there's 2 parts, a dorsal part and a ventral part, right? A posterior and an anterior part of the spinal nerve that comes together, and then they come together and then they leave the vertebral. So the nerves actually come and they emanate out from between the connections of vertebrae, okay? And there you have 31 spinal nerves, and we'll see that in a little bit, and each one is numbered for the vertebrae it comes out of. Okay, here's another look at the roots and the different meninges. So you have the dura mater here on the outside. Underneath that is the arachnoid. You can see it kind of looks like a webbing, and then the pia mater is this actual kind of whitish covering that's around the spinal cord, and you can see that really, really well on a piece of the spinal cord if you were to dissect it. And then here's a spinal nerve. Let's move this over. So this whole thing is a spinal nerve. This whole thing is a spinal nerve, and you have the posterior root and a posterior root gang. That's so you can know which one is the posterior root, because the anterior doesn't have a ganglia, but the posterior does. So the posterior root ganglia, okay, gives you that. All right. So other parts of the spinal cord you need to know that they're going to talk about. There is you'll note the little black hole that's right here. Okay, that's the central canal, right? And spinal fluid runs through there as well. And then you have the gray matter crosses over, right? In that area, that kind of bridge from one side to the other is called the gray commissure. Okay, so the gray commissure is this whole area right here of the gray matter that bridges from one side to the other, and it allows for neurons on the left to go to the right and crosstalk from one side to the other. So another gray and white matter organization, you have the outside are the white matter, on the inside interior is the gray matter. And just like we talked about, I mentioned the horns before, the posterior and the lateral and anterior horns, right? Those are those areas. Actually, let's do this in different colors so you can kind of see it. The posterior horn is back here, and the lateral horn is right there. Okay, so that you can kind of see where those areas are in the gray commissure that we just talked about, the central canal. We can also talk and mention different areas of the white matter. Okay, so we have the posterior funiculus. That's this area of the white matter back there. the lateral funiculus, that's over here, and the anterior funiculus over here. Okay, so you kind of think about spatial alignments and where these things are. You can use terminology to identify where these axons are, right? And it's important. These funiculus can also be called columns, because which way does the spinal cord run, right? It runs, so you have your little stick figure guy, right? It runs vertically. It runs up and down. And those columns, they run up and down. Okay, so they run up and down. So that brings images to and from, right? So those columns, you know what a column on a spreadsheet is vertical, right? While a row is horizontal. So we talk about these can be called columns. They can also be called columns. And here you can see a cadaver piece of the spinal cord, and it gives you the posterior, the lateral, and the anterior horn. And again, the gray matter will look different depending upon which area of the spinal cord you're looking at, whether it's the cervical or the thoracic or the lumbar sacral region. The gray matter will change. The shape of the gray, this butterfly type shape. See this butterfly type shape here? It will change dependent upon, right? So in some places you may not have a lateral horn. In some places you will. Okay. So in the spinal cord is in the central nervous system, and it helps relay information to and from. So it takes in somatic sensory information, visceral sensory information, and relays those messages to motor neurons. And there's a couple different ones that are important. So if you look at this, this picture actually gives you a really good idea about what the separation between a posterior root and an anterior root. Why is there two parts, and what's the importance of that? And then why they come together in a spinal nerve. Okay, so this whole thing is a spinal nerve, and it has both sensory and motor information. All right, so that means it has to have afferent neurons, one's coming in, and then efferent neurons, one's going out. Okay, so spinal nerves typically have a number of different neurons. In this one, for instance, they have somatic and visceral sensory information. So visceral are obviously going to come from the internal organs, and somatic are going to be from general sense receptors. That's not making any sense. We'll just say sense receptors. Sense receptors is fine, right? But they have input, and that goes to the posterior part. So the posterior root that we have, right, where the ganglia are, so this is going to be in, and you have the ganglia. That posterior root is actually sensory information. So this is going towards the spinal cord. Information is going towards, okay? And it comes in, and then it goes through the gray matter, as you can see here. And in some cases, the information terminates on a interneuron, or sometimes it jumps over, right? But here they're actually showing you several different interneurons, some intermediate neurons, and then those neurons move over, and now you have efferent nerves, right? Efferent, those are outgoing, and those are motor neurons. So the anterior root is motor. So all these motor neurons go out, and so this information is actually going out, okay? This information is coming in. So the spinal nerve is actually made up of both somatic and sensory information. And with that, the color coding of this picture actually shows you the different nuclei. Now, nuclei is, what is a nuclei in this case? This is a collection of cell bodies in the central nervous system, right? So it's equal This is the same thing as you know, it's just equal to a ganglia in the PNS, right? So here's the color coding is important. So here's somatic sensory and visceral sensory nuclei. That's what you have here in that posterior horn of the gray matter. And then you have the autonomic, the automatic, and the somatic motor nuclei that go out, right? So you have the posterior root comes back. Posterior root comes in, right, and relays that information over to a motor root, and then it goes out. And there's an autonomic part to this and a somatic part to this. And the autonomic is really an involuntary automatic responses, and the somatic is a, you know, conscious thought, right? Kind of a voluntary responses. Oh, okay. So there's your 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Each nerve is formed from that anterior root or ventral root and the posterior root coming together. The posterior root is mainly sensory, right? Axons of sensory neuron. Oops, no, I want this one. Sensory neurons. While the anterior root is motor neurons. Okay? We mentioned before that each nerve is named for part of the spinal cord it comes from, so cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, okay? And then you have C1 to C8, except, so you don't have a C8 vertebrae. So this one, it actually exits, little exception to the rule here, it exits below C7, right? And then it's named for the number. So T2 exits between T3 and T4, no, T2 and T3. And the lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal spinal nerves all have long roots that extend inferiorly. The spinal nerve, the spinal cord, actually ends at around L1, right? Lumbar vertebrae 1. So it ends, the spinal cord. The cord kind of ends about L1, okay? Be inferior to L1, you have this thing called the cauda equina, which literally means horse tail, okay? The cauda equina is really nerves that emanate off. So the spinal cord ends something like this, comes down and ends in a little cone at about L1, and then off of that you have a collection of these spinal nerves that extend down, lots of them, and then they emanate off of the other vertebrae, L2, L3, L4, L5, the sacral ones, right? They all kind of go like, and it kind of looks like a horse's tail. Okay, so we talked about the different parts. So let's talk about the spinal nerves. Okay, after the dorsal root come together. Okay, after they come together past the posterior and anterior root, it splits again. So then part of this, part of the spinal nerve, then part of it goes to the posterior and the other part goes to the anterior. Think about where the spinal cord is. It's on the posterior dorsal cavity, right? So if we're looking at a side view, I'm going to show the brain. Okay, here's our brain. And then the spinal cord comes down, right, and ends. That is on the posterior part of the body. Okay, this is anterior. Okay, so to the posterior part of the body, the nerves only have to go a short distance. Okay, but to the anterior part of the body, the nerves have to kind of come around. So they have to go a little bit longer. And those are what's called ramuses. A ramus is a branch of a spinal nerve. Okay, so we have roots, which come together to form the spinal nerve, and then after it leaves the vertebrae, that spinal nerve splits into branches. Okay, if you think about it like a tree, you have roots that come together. You have, roots that come together to form the trunk, and then they split into branches. Okay, so that's what those ramus are. And the rami communicants are small branches of autonomic fibers. We'll mention those a little bit when we talk about the autonomic nervous system later. All right. So here's your spinal nerve branches. Okay, you can see here's your root, comes together, and then it comes out, and then it branches off. There's parts that branch off from there. Okay, here's the anterior ramus, and here's a posterior ramus. So this is one big branch, goes out this way. Okay, and this branch also goes to the sympathetic trunk, which we'll talk about in a second. We'll talk about when in the autonomic nervous system. Anterior ramus goes out that way, and then the posterior ramus goes back to the deep muscles of the back, right, and goes either further out to the skin. While the anterior would actually extend out and around, right, to the visceral organs, to the skin and muscles of the anterior. Okay, and so they have the whole thing. And your rami communicants, that's kind of this extension of the sympathetic trunk. Ganglia, right? Ganglia, collection of cell bodies. Autonomic motor neurons. Okay? Each of these spinal nerves serve a segment of the skin. And we can break that up in what's called dermatomes. Okay? They have some in overlap of these regions, but you can think about it like there's a segment of the skin that is served and innervated by that particular spinal nerve, all right, and it's involved in referred visceral pain. Sometimes you may say like referred pain is where you have something happening in one area of the body, especially like on the internal, and you end up making or getting a pain in some other area of the body. That is called referred pain. And because the spinal nerves are involved with this, or there's that connections, this is how referred pain. Okay, so let's talk about plexuses. Okay, a plexus is a network of interweaving anterior rami of spinal cords, spinal nerves. So we said that rami were what? They were branches. Okay, so it's a branch. So at this point we have two roots. So this is root, comes off the spinal cord, right? And you have that butterfly area of the spinal cord. That's your gray matter, right? So you have a posterior root and an anterior root that come together, right? And you have the posterior ganglion, and then off of that it splits. Okay, let's do it this way. Okay, it splits, and this is your posterior ramus branch, and this is your anterior ramus. Okay, and that branch. So now then, what a plexus is, this anterior ramus can break into further branches, right? And then it actually can come back, in some places, it comes back together and forms a plexus, All right, you'll see that drawing is not very well, but just kind of helping you think about it. There's four main plexuses that you need to be responsible for. And you'll see that there's many nerves that come off them. So you have cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral plexuses. Okay? More than two. Oh, okay. Two? Yeah. So here's some intercostal nerves. Okay, sympathetic trunk runs through, right? Those kind of connect 1, 2, 3, right? That little pearl necklace that we had talked about in lecture. And then off those spinal nerves, you have a intercostal nerve that runs right underneath, as you can see, runs right underneath the rib and then innervates in front. Okay, but here's a good example of the different parts of the spinal cord. And here are your plexuses, brachial. So you have your cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral, lumbar and sacral plexuses. Okay, these plexuses, you can see that these anterior, if you look, the anterior parts of the nerves, the rami come together and form other connections. So they connect to other things. Here's the brachial plexus, right? It goes through there and then it would run down the arm. And here's a cervical plexus in here, and then some of those neurons run down the arm as well. Okay, so they divide soon. The spinal nerves divide soon after leaving the spinal cord. That's what a ramus is. Dorsal and ventral rami. The dorsal rami serve the skin and muscles of the posterior trunk. Okay, whereas the ventral rami, they form this complex network of complex of networks, what they call plexuses for the anterior. Okay, here's a good visual I was trying to draw, but I didn't really do a good job of it. This is better. All right, here's your dorsal ramus. Does it pretty short, stays here in the dorsal area, the skin and back, but the ventral or the anterior ramus goes out and has to extend all the way out, right? And at this point, it's not showing the plexuses, but just giving you an idea of the complexity of the ramus on the anterior. Okay, so a plexus is a network of nerves serving motor and sensory needs of the limbs. So we'll talk about cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral. Okay, and I want you to know the nerves that come from these plexuses. All right, so you're responsible for those. So the cervical plexus, all right, originates from ventral rami of C1 to C5. All right, the important nerve. You have to know one. What's the important nerve? The phrenic nerve. Okay, and that goes right to the diaphragm. Okay, that goes right to the diaphragm. It also serves the shoulder and back, but the diaphragm's been important for, obviously, for skeletal muscle, for breathing, for respiration. Okay. So here's C1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Here are the spinal nerves. They come out, and you can see they kind of start to branch, and then the anterior branches come together and form this plexus, and here's the phrenic nerve that leaves this plexus. All right, so here's this complex network of nerves that come together. All right, you also have other nerves important here: hypoglossal, the accessory nerve, the auricular nerve, the lesser occipital nerve. Right, but the one I want you to be important to, here's the branch to the brachial plexus. Here's the phrenic nerve, comes out of the cervical plexus. Okay. From the brachial plexus, you have a couple different ones, okay? And if you note, the brachial means what? It means arm, okay? This is from the ventral rami of C5, C8, and T1. So the last part of the cervical spinal cord, the spinal nerves, and the first part of the thoracic nerve, okay? And which you can see, all of these are related to the arms. This is the axillary, goes to the armpit, obviously radial to the radius, ulnar to the ulna, right? And the other two go towards the forearm and the hand. So the shoulder, arm, forearm, and hand. So anything, any motor neuron that goes out from the ventral or the dorsal ramus, any sensory information is going to go through this brachial plexus from the hand. Okay, so here you see, this is showing you different parts of C5, 6, 7, 8, and T1 come together, and the different colors show you where they are, and you have the terminal branches. Here's your ulnar nerve. Let's move this over. Here's the musculocutaneous nerve, the median nerve, the axillary nerve, and the radial nerve. They come out of this trunk, out of this brachial plexus. And here's another example, another picture showing you the major nerves of the upper limb, right? And ulna, radius, ulnar nerve, radial nerve, median nerve, okay? And the ulnar nerve is the one you hit when you hit your quote-unquote funny bone, right? You hit your arm, hit your elbow, and you get that tingling sensation down your fingers. You're going to pinch that ulnar nerve, and it feels funny for a little bit. Okay, the lumbar plexus. These are going to be important for your legs, right? The lower abdomen and the anterior and the medial thighs. Big one, and it's highlighted, is your femoral nerve, right, which is going to go right down right down by the femur. The obturator is also in there, all right, which goes through the obturator foramen of the pelvic bone, right? And these, the spinal nerve plexus for the lumbar plexus originates from ventral rami L1 through 4. Okay, so here we're showing your femoral nerve, right? And you see this big one right here. It comes right in the front, and then it branches out. And then the obturator is right here, and where does it go through? The obturator foramen. Okay, and that branches into this one, a couple different ones. Okay, lumbar plexus, the anterior view. And you can see that here's L1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on this side. Okay, over here. And they come together, right? The branching extensively. So now you have L1 that actually runs into this. And now you have the obturator nerve and the femoral nerve, which is the big one that you have to know, goes down to the front of the thigh. And then we have the sacral plexus. This originates from ventral rami in L4, L5, and S1 to S4. So that last part of those of the vertebral column, those spinal nerves come out of. The important nerves here, sciatic, you probably have heard of that before, and the tibial and fibular nerves. All right, so this serves areas of the lower trunk, the posterior thigh, the back of the leg, and the lateral and posterior leg and foot. All right, so the femoral nerve does the whole front of the leg, and the back of the leg is the sacral plexus. All right, so you may have heard of someone who has sciatic pain or sciatica. That is usually associated with muscles or inflammation that are pressing on that sciatic nerve, and that's causing pain from them running down from their lower back and maybe emanating down their leg, down the back of their thigh, down the hamstrings and the gluteal muscles, and even into the lower lumbar region of the back. The sciatic is the longest and thickest nerve in the body. You can see it here. Okay, so it comes out of the back, and this right here is the sciatic nerve, and then it splits, all right, into the tibial, okay, which is there, and the fibular, which is here, okay. And again, on this side you see L1, L4, 5, S1 through 4, and how they come together. You can see the structure of this sciatic nerve, right? Sciatic is really, really big, and it shows they have a fibular division, which is the outside of the side of the leg, and then the tibial division, which goes right down the middle of the back of the leg and all the way down to the back of the foot. So that covers the structure of the spinal cord, the spinal nerves, and the plexuses, and important nerves that are present in the spinal cord. Now let's talk about reflexes, because some of this, what you end up with in response to the body when you have sensory information come in and a motor output, sometimes that motor output is not conscious, and it is just, it's done kind of programmed response, and it's a fast response. Okay, you put your hand on a hot stove, you immediately pull it back. You step on a Lego with bare feet in the house, or on a nail, and you feel that, and immediately you pull your foot back, and in the same time you're balancing on your other foot. Okay, this is a reflex. It's an involuntary response. It's programmed response. It's a rapid programmed response. Okay, so it's programmed, means it always stays the same. Okay, in order you put your hand on a hot stove, you're gonna pull it back unless you consciously think about it and hold it there. If you don't do it, the response is involuntary. Okay, there's no intent or awareness of the reflex before it happens. You're not saying, "Hey, I'm gonna put my hand there and pull it back because it's hot," before you know it is. All right, the reflex is a survival mechanism. Okay, we respond to potentially detrimental stimulus. Hand on a hot stove, burning. Stepping on something sharp, it hurts. Right? You pull back right away and you try to save protect yourself. Right? And awareness comes later. Oh, that was a hot stove. Or, hey, that's a Lego that I stepped on. I don't want to step on that now. Okay? So reflex arcs have a distinct components. Okay? This is a reflex arc, and there's components of this reflex system. Usually there's only a couple neurons involved. There could be one, or there could be two neurons, or there could be three neurons. So this is an example of a 3-neuron response, right? Every reflex arc has a receptor. Okay, so he starts receptor. So some type of, in this case, you see the nail in the skin. Okay, that sends sensory information in. So that's one receptor, and then we have a sensory neuron. And that sends information to the central nervous system. Okay, nerve signal is processed, right? And many times there's an interneuron. So we have a processing. So the interneuron is important here. And the interneuron immediately, you'll see it actually branches in two spots, right? It immediately terminates on a motor neuron. So that's one is the receptor, two is the sensory neuron, three is the integration center, okay? And usually that's the central nervous system or the interneuron, okay? And then number 4 is going to be your motor neuron, which then activates the last part, number 5, the effector. In this case, in many of these cases, it is a muscle, right? In the somatic spinal reflexes, they're pretty much all muscles. So we have receptor, sensory neuron, integration center, motor neuron, which is going to be output, and then the effector does whatever it is. So you put your hand on the stove, sensory information comes in from the skin through the sensory neuron to an interneuron, which then immediately activates your effector response, right, to the output muscles and contracts the brachialis muscles and pulls your hand away because, hey, that's too sharp, or in this case, too sharp with the nail. So in this case, it went one neuron, second neuron, third neuron. There are some cases where it can just go, and I'll draw this in green. The sensory information can come in, go through, and actually can terminate right on this motor neuron, bypassing the central neuron, bypassing the interneuron, right? So that's a two neuron reflex. Okay, reflex. And with the interneuron, there's a 3-neuron reflex. Okay. Okay. Now, spinal reflexes, they have that structure. Now, that last one we just talked about was a 3-neuron reflex arc. Okay. So we can classify them in a couple different ways. One of the ways is whether or not there's 2 or 3 neurons. All right. What that is here is it monosynaptic or polysynaptic? Monosynaptic is really a space between 2 neurons, while polysynaptic is a space between 3 neurons. Okay? Because you have more than one synapse or one synapse, right? That's what monosynaptic means, one synapse. You only have one synapse when, the spot between two neurons. We can classify whether spinal or cranial, right? Is the spinal cord or the brain the reflex integration center? Is it somatic or visceral? Is the effector a skeletal muscle? If it is, that's somatic. Okay, somatic. Oh no, that's not what I want to do. This somatic effector skeletal muscle, or is it visceral, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or a gland? Okay, and then here you have monosynaptic versus polysynaptic neurons. Okay, ipsilateral or contralateral. Ipsilateral means it's on the same side. Okay, so ipsilateral, same side. Contralateral, opposite sides. And is it innate or acquired? Are you born with the reflex? Do you just do this from the beginning, or do you learn it after birth? Right? Do you acquire that? Here's a couple examples. So here's a monosynaptic reflex. Okay, you'll note here 1 neuron, so receptor, stretch receptor comes in, sensory information, integration center. There's no interneuron. It immediately terminates on the motor neuron, and motor neuron then stimulates the effector organ, and you get your leg kick. Polysynaptic, okay? We have sensory receptor, interneuron, so 1 synapse, 2 synapse, effector moves. All right, so and examples on the stretch reflex when you hit the patella tendon, you did that in lab. All right, that's a monosynaptic reflex, while the ones I've been talking, you put your hand over a hot flame, that is a polysynaptic. Withdrawal reflex is a polysynaptic reflex. Okay, so here's the stretch reflex. Examples, it's classified as spinal. Okay, so it's the spinal cord. Somatic, what's the effector muscle? It's got to be a skeletal muscle. Ipsilateral means it's on the same side, and it's innate, means you were born with it. You don't have to learn how to do that. Okay? And here's your biceps stretch reflex. Right, and this kind of shows the muscle spindle stretches. So that's the receptor. That's the 1 part, right? The receptor. Here's the motor neuron 2. Right, here's Here's 3, the sensory neurons. In this case, the sensory neuron synapses on alpha motor neurons. So there's your integration center 3, motor neuron 4, and effector muscle 5. The Golgi tendon reflex. Okay, so this detects excessive tension. This is a spinal reflex. Okay, and this is a polysynaptic reflex. So there are pressure receptors. That's what proprioceptors mean. Pressure receptors with sensory ending at the muscle tendon junction. Their sensory axons excite interneurons in the spinal cord. Right, so they excite the interneurons, so that means it's polysynaptic. right? And they actually go for it. So let's see what it looks like. Okay, so where's the receptors? Here's number one. Muscle contraction increases to tendons, detecting the Golgi tendon organ, right? Stretch. So there's your receptor, sensory information. So receptor, sensory neuron, interneuron to the motor neuron, and then that pulls back, right? And then your effector muscles. Interneurons stimulate to agonist muscles and reciprocal action. I've talked about many times the withdrawal reflex. This is a spinal reflex. It is somatic. It is ipsilateral. It's on the same side, right? And it's innate. It kind of happens as you do it. Okay, withdrawal. We've done that one a couple times, so it happens quickly. What's there? And then the crossed extensor reflex, another spinal reflex, right? Think about it like this. You go to step on a nail. This kind of is in with, so you step on a nail. What's your right leg want to do? So if you step on a nail with your right foot, what's your right leg want to do? It wants to pull back. It pulls back. So on the opposite side, your opposite leg, the left leg, now has to support your body weight. So this is what we call the crossed extensor reflex. It occurs in conjunction with the withdrawal reflex. All right? And so as the left leg, in this case they give the example about the left leg is withdrawn. Okay, left leg was withdrawn. The right leg's quadriceps is excited to help support the body. In this case, this is a contralateral reflex. Okay, contralateral, because it happens on the opposite side. It is still a spinal reflex. Okay, and this is what it looks like. So here's your withdrawal reflex that we just talked about. Right, withdrawal comes in, right, and in this case, you see the interneuron crosses over through the gray commissure, motor and output, and then goes to the quadriceps muscles in the opposite leg, and makes them tense because they're going to support your body weight. All right, but it's still a reflex. It's still known. It is innate. You don't have to learn to do it, and it goes from there. You have to learn to walk prior to it happening, but it is what it is. So that concludes the spinal cord. From this lecture, you should know about spinal cord anatomy. Right, so you should know. So spinal cord and spinal nerves. Okay, so and even reflexes. Okay, so we have spinal cord anatomy. That means the different parts of the spinal cord, the different sections, different enlargements. You should know the structure of spinal nerves. Right, we have the ventral and dorsal roots. You should know what a ramus is. You should know what plexuses are, and nerves associated with certain plexuses. And I went over 4, right? We did the cervical, we did brachial, lumbar, and sacral. And there's nerves that are involved with each of those. And then reflexes, you should know what a spinal reflex is, what the parts, parts of a spinal reflex arc. 2 neuron versus 3 neuron. And then you have 4 examples of spinal reflexes. Right now is withdrawal, the Golgi tendon, the stretch reflex, and the crossed extensor. Okay, so that's what you're expected to know from this spinal cord lecture. If you have any questions or need further information, clarity, feel free to email me, and this will be on your exam 4 and final.